Hello, everyone. Welcome back to OpenITI Conversations. I'm here today with Sarah Savant, who's going to be telling us about her current book project, how she deals with data, with the writing process, and lots of other fun things. Sarah, I'm going to start out by just letting you introduce yourself and the Kitab project that you're a part of, and then talk a little bit about the book project that you are currently, I guess, kind of in the finishing stages of.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope
Inshallah.
so. Inshallah. So yes, Jonathan, and I hope we'll make this a conversation. So if I go astray, just bring me back. But it's really nice to be here. The Kitab project started in, gosh, I think 2013.
Goodness.
And yes, goodness. And in fact, well, yeah, one of my colleagues the other day said that he'd been working on this book chapter since he began his PhD. And I said, I began working on the current book I'll discuss in 2016, at which point he pointed out that that's when he began his PhD.
Oh,
So yeah, it's
time
been
flies.
kicking around for a while. Time flies, time flies. I don't know if it flew, but it passed. So the essentially, let me just summarize maybe what the Kitab project is, because not everybody might know that. So the Kitab project, the name Kitab stands for Knowledge, Information Technology, and the Arabic Book.
Did
And
not actually.
okay, yeah, okay. And Kitab also, of course, is the Arabic word for book, what have you, in Arabic script languages. So the project began in the context of working on a corpus in Arabic. So it began with Arabic, and also trying to understand how authors copied books from each other. My first idea, as I love to say, came and arose from using plagiarism software for student papers. And that would have been somewhere around 2011. And I thought it was such an interesting idea that I wrote to turn it in. And I asked if they might want to develop this for the field. And I think the first time I got no response, and maybe I got a response the second time, but anyway, it went nowhere. And then Greg Crane introduced me to David Smith in Northeastern. And sometime around 2013, 14, we assembled a group. And I had a volunteer group running for some years that was really possible because of the Ismaili network that goes by the name of TKN. So I work for the Aga Khan University, which is based in Pakistan, but an international university. And we have lots of volunteers from within the network of the Aga Khan, the group known as Ismailis. It's a religious group. So these people really generously gave their time and their knowledge. And maybe once a week for many years until about 2018, so about 4 years, maybe even 5, we met and discussed how to create a data set, how to model different questions that we essentially had about text reuse. And in the background was David Smith, who is advising us on how to run things. So we assembled a data set sometime around, I want to say 2015, the first one. And this was based on running a section of Arabic books. And from then onwards, we began to try to understand the data. When it first came out, I was dancing in my kitchen, which is actually where I am right now. I was so excited because I had all these files. I'll show you a couple in a minute. And then I realized that there was no way I could do anything with them. I didn't know what to do. All I could see was that there was proof that these books were related to each other. This term text reuse that I just casually used and falsely insinuated that it's plagiarism. What I really mean is Donald Sturgeon, a great scholar of Chinese digital humanities, described text reuse as extended similarity. So when you have a textual passage and another textual passage, in our case, between two books, and you know that they're related in some way, however distant. It may not be that one copied from the other, but that they're related. So it's this sometimes intuition of the human that we try to capture with the algorithms to see, specifically PASM, created by David Smith, to see these alignments, what we call alignments between two books. So anyway, we had lots and lots, thousands of files of these alignments many years ago. And it's only now in around 2024 that the book is finally coming out that tries to work through what all this data means. We have 1.6 million files that documents relationships within our corpus. We have 8,600 books, individual works, over a billion words worth of Arabic. So we have all these different relationships, between and among the books. And that's what I set myself the task of trying to make sense of many years ago in the kitchen, and now hopefully through EUP, Edinburgh University Press.
Okay.
There's two books, actually. There's my book, and then there's also the project teams. So my book is volume 1, and it's called A Cultural History of the Arabic Book. And then the project team is volume 2. Yeah, and it'll be out, inshallah, in 2025, although maybe 2026, depending on how production and all that goes. So that gets us started, I hope.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think we got a decent sense of what your book is about, and hopefully have you back on in the near future to maybe go into some more detail of some of the specific like historiographic aspects. But I think what I'll talk about now is kind of the process that you have taken over the years of working on this book. So obviously that could entail a lot of things. Maybe start out with just some really like straightforward stuff, like what kind of word processor do you use? Do you have a particular workflow for taking notes? And like, what is that? What does this look like? Both the kind of the writing, the note taking, the sort of organization of things, given that you have a lot of data, and that you're producing material, you're analyzing material in a way that isn't, I wouldn't say is entirely, it's not the norm in kind of Islamic and humanities.
Right. There's definitely a lot of details in what we're publishing, or I'm publishing in my book. And I wish I could say that I set out with a specific plan and knew how I was going to deal with all of these files. And that's essentially what the book is about, trying to understand the big picture.
Yeah.
And then a couple of smaller pictures within it. But I confess that in the beginning, I underestimated how even, let's say this, and already, let's say by 2017, I think I understood the big picture fairly decently. I understood that most books in the Arabic corpus are connected to another book. I understood that we could find and align very precisely pairs of books. I understood, which you didn't have to have digital humanities to know this, that the Hadith works were very much related to each other, and that histories likewise in different ways. But what I didn't know how to do was to actually break the problem down. And that's, I think, what I've managed to do over quite a long period of time. The most important practical thing that I think I did, and my team members or project members have done, is to blog. So we began, we received ERC, and before that, actually British Academy funding, and also funding from the Aga Khan University. So with chiefly the ERC funding, we began blogging quite a lot of the initial thoughts, let's say, that were at a distance. So sometime around 2017, I wrote a blog that talked about the Muwatta of Malik and the versions, of this work that were really quite distinct, even though they all carry the same title. And that enabled me to try to get into the idea of what is a book. How do you know something's a book? And I have to confess that it wasn't until much later that I formulated a concrete definition of what a book is. And that took a lot of iteration. So for me, and I think the project team, we've co-written parts of this, a book is a social idea. So by which we mean that you can have oftentimes two texts, so two writings or instances of writing that are very closely related, but within the tradition, folks will disagree or say, no, but these are, one is a rawaya, and the student actually should be reckoned as the author, of the teachers. So these are two different books. We also have lots of cases of very distinct writings, like Khlayla wa Dimna, where you'll have nonetheless, even in the absence of an acknowledged and genuine, let's call it, author, you'll have cases where people say, no, it's the same book. So these kinds of debates that we had working on our corpus every week actually feed through then into the definition within the book too. So I would say there was a lot of iteration between having to think through pragmatics, in the corpus development, writing in blogs, data releases. So none of this like immediately translates into writing in a word processor, but I think was really important. And it is really, I think, how a lot of people in digital humanities do work, collaboratively within debates, puzzling over data sets, trying to find ways to structure data sets in ways that can be communicated. And that those kind of, let's say, more elemental acts of communication were super important, not only for obviously doing the act of communicating, but for helping us to understand what the big picture was. So every time I wrote a blog, I felt like I understood something better. And then in the book, I'm citing a lot of these data sets, to say, you can find this in the open access repository Zenodo. And, here's a link. So it also helped nail down things because these were not casual releases, the Zenodo releases. They were every bit. There was one on Ibn Asakir, which we can talk about in a minute, maybe, that was 40,000 words. And it was with my colleague, Masume Saidi. So it was itself sort of a book within a book. In terms of word processing, you people have such different views on this, right? Like people I use Word, controversial, but I do. I say because it doesn't always handle what I want it to handle. But for working with the data, and especially the files, I work with Google Sheets. I long ago gave up on Excel doing anything with my data. But I can easily work with 80,000 rows, of text reuse or isnads in Google Sheets. What other practical things? We do a lot of workflows using Slack, as you know, and trying to keep track of different things because there's a lot of keeping track and communicating. It's important to have channels when you're working in teams, so that you can separate out the issues and sort of feed back to each other. Yeah, so those are like kind of very, very practical things, attached to the book. Do you want me to circle back to the book, or do you want me to go more practical?
Yeah,
What would
actually, I
be
have a
best?
question. This is not really practical. This is really kind of more, I guess, the philosophical level. But I like your description of your book project as almost kind of being almost like an emergent quality out of all of these things you've been doing over the last several years. And so
Mm,
as I'm wondering, if you think about the kind of standard scholarly monograph, particularly in the
mm,
it's the work usually of a single scholar. Sometimes
yeah, yeah,
co-written works, but the model really is this unitary object that a single scholar produces. Uh,
right.
and what you're describing is obviously quite different from that. Like collaborative gets overused, it's almost cliche, but it really is like what you're describing isn't just collaborative, but it's multiple people, but also these different approaches and kind of data sets and
Yeah,
of writing. And so, you're then taking all of this and condensing it or putting it in book form. So I'm just wondering,
yeah.
how do you, I don't know, like what are maybe the challenges that you have faced in taking that, we'll call it like kind of the emergent quality out of all these things and putting them in a, pretty standard monograph. Uh,
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting, especially since the book is about book writing, that in fact, the author, who is it?
yeah.
So in my first version of, I submitted to a colleague a draft of some chapters, and he very helpfully went through it. I mean, he went through all sorts of pieces of it. There's a lot of Arabic that he was, debating with me on the meaning of this or that word. But one of the points he made across all of it, and which he found really irritating, I think, was that I referred to we so often.
Mm.
And he said, "Who is we?" Sometimes you say I and sometimes you say we. And to be honest, I hadn't noticed.
Mhm.
And I'm I'm not proud of that. But I think what has happened over the years is there's been so many times in these, particularly in our corpus meetings on Mondays, when we get together and discuss how to adjust a URI, for example, so a unique resource identifier for a work, that might be from, the 9th century, and this person says it's by this author and this one says it's by another author, and you have a long digressive debate. Or what do you do with a majmua? Like, what do you do with a multi-text compilation where you've got different pieces together? All these kind of major questions made us think about books together. And it at some point became quite hard to find my own voice. But I do have my own voice, and I sometimes disagree with my team members. And also, I think the phrasing and the way I've pulled it together is the authorial intervention. So to me, and I think in the field, we need to have a lot more thought about how this works. We've each tried to write, the team members particularly have tried to write their own works apart from the collected book. So they have, they should and they deserve credit for going beyond what's the collective effort, let's say, but they've also produced this collective work, which is a witness to the project. For me, I've done a lot of co-writing at the sub-book level. And, with this, the blogs, I mentioned Masumi Saidi, she's been a major partner to me, not just in working on the data, which we do together, in like designing the questions and etc. But while she hasn't written it, she has been the sounding board, for so much. And I thought it was important to recognize that as also authorial. So at the level of all of the blogs, and we have journal articles we're still working on, we're co-authors. At the level of the book where it all came together, I've labeled us both as co-creators of the data, because that's the level at which that conversation, holds together, I think. But I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but this is the kinds
I
of,
think they're definitely kind of getting
that
at.
come. Yeah.
It's also
But I never
interesting.
feel quite comfortable with it, to be frank, especially as a PI, because, yeah, so, yeah, I mean, it's important that the voices of the people who create, and we also, I should say, have been trying very hard, maybe not always perfectly, but to acknowledge the very many people who do work on the text themselves. So the URI system, as you know, recognizes the repositories from which we take texts. The files on GitHub recognize the people who contribute to improving them, the data quality and the vetting. We've had one team member, Hamid Reza Hakimi, who's been amazing and has done all sorts of really important data verification tasks over the years. So these people also, I think we've tried to, make sure that they get acknowledged, including in acknowledgements and then in footnotes, in blogs, and permanently within the OpenITI. So that's also important. There's no way one can do, like you say, there's no such thing as the quiet author working alone in this kind of work, because it involves both philological expertise, historical expertise, technical expertise, and we all lean on each other in different ways. Codicological expertise, as you know very, very well. So many of us, it's many hands, go into creating any book, out of this kind of project. So, and a book is not a project, is the other point. Project is something bigger. Yeah.
It's really, I love that there's a kind of a what's the word? Like almost a meta relationship between what you're doing and what was happening in the tradition that you're studying. Like this,
Yeah.
this sort of book as a kind of hard to pin down object in the end. Like, where are the boundaries? What is who is the author? What is the author? And thinking in these kind of more expansive and kind of social terms. It's an interesting kind of a loop almost.
Yeah, and yet even after having years of thinking about these issues, I wrote it in a way that reflected the way I was thinking, but that wasn't as self-aware as I didn't understand. I was surprised my reviewer said this, which I shouldn't have been surprised by. So I have promised to go back through and to read and make sure I agree with all my we's and I's. But I've also added a whole justification for the use of the language, at the beginning of the book, in response to, reviewer B, this point, this is why.
So I think the last thing maybe to talk about is numbers.
Okay.
Because obviously there are a lot of numbers in the work that you're doing.
Mm,
Maybe we can just talk a little bit about, well, first of all, what kinds of things are you counting?
okay.
You kind of touched on this already, but maybe just talk a little bit more about like what you've been counting, how you've been doing the counting, and maybe how you're thinking about numbers and it has maybe evolved or changed over time.
Mm, mm. Right, right. I've always liked numbers. So I've
I
never
was
been
wondering
afraid of
that
a
too, like
number.
it's something
Yeah.
that as you discovered this project, this question, were you
Yeah.
like, oh man, I've got to deal with like numbers and counting things? Or are you excited to count stuff?
Well, I think I knew the limits of my ability to do so. I mean, I think I knew that I was not a statistician by a very long ways. And I also knew that I would have to up my game, in how I dealt with numbers. However, once you get started, it's quite fun. So uh, in the book, I didn't realize till I finished the book about how many numbers there were. And in the conclusion, I reflect on this point. And I think this is the next article for Masumi and I to write. But counting things, so we count the number of books, we count the size of books. I'm often surprised. I'll say to people, what is the biggest book, in maybe the OpenITI prior to the year 1500 or 1000 Hijri? Let's say 1000 Hijri. And I get blank looks, including by scholars of Ibn Asakir, who wrote like by a country mile the longest book in the OpenITI. So I don't think we as historians walk around thinking about size actually, whereas it does matter if a book is 70 volumes in the modern printed edition versus one, how it was created will be different. And so, size of books, word counts, we counted isnads, we counted how many, this was thanks to Ryan Muther, who wrote a brilliant, well, he was able to write and train a model to detect isnads across the corpus, and then to be able to segment them based on training data that was generated by the team, to say, this is how many isnads there are in every work, and to count, and then how many words, and then what percentage of every book was made up of isnads. And then I charted this across time, like in a graph, to show that like they go up and then they go down. Which maybe intuitively knew, but like I think when you separate it out by types of work, it was a little different than what we expected. So counted isnads, we counted names. That was a big one in isnads. So there's a lot of isnad citation because we're not just interested in finding reuse, but we're interested in explaining what we're finding. And for me, a major question was, who are they citing and what are they citing? So we counted for Ibn Asakir the number of people he said he spoke to, and we counted the different transmission terms he used, the ways he said that he got information from them, and we counted the ways that each one of the people in this NADS had those terms applied. We counted the varieties of ways he referred to the same person who was his direct informant. And then we counted probably a whole lot of other things with that. But like by counting all these names, for example, it raises the question of why does he refer to the people he knew most in far more ways than the people who are many centuries earlier? What's going on here? And that opens up onto the question of like, was he collating, some sort of isnads? Garrett Davidson's made this argument that in the post-canonical period, there's a, let's say, valoration of isnads and the chains of transmission themselves. Do all these varieties of names point in that direction? And so, like, you would think, and I believe me, like, there was some point deep into COVID where I was going crazy because I was just normalizing in my data. So, I have a file with names, and then for each name, there's a column where I put all the various Arabic ones. So I put the normalized name and then all the variants. And I have hundreds, for some of these people that he knew directly. Yeah. And I thought, what is he doing? And it was driving me insane, Jonathan. I thought, like, this makes no sense. Like, what is he doing? And I still am not convinced he's collating them because I think it would have been too chaotic. Exactly. I mean, if he was collating, he would have normalized. He wouldn't leave it to me to do
Yeah.
that, I think. But but it does tell you something about because once you normalize them, you see the patterns in the isnads themselves. So he is citing, the same people. He's citing a finite number of people. He's just using different names for them. And that's the same for other authors like Tabari. So you start to realize that they have a finite network. They're human beings. They're collecting materials. They're collecting it in written form, but they're probably not collecting it straight from books. They're collecting fragments of things.
Right.
They're collecting they're collecting lists of names too. But it's just really interesting. So counting things, I think that was the big revelation of the project. And to do so, we've had to really, Masume and I have had to create like really elaborate lists of things. So we have lists of titles, and all the various forms. We have lists of these names that I'm mentioning, all names. We have lists of author names as a subset of that list. Yeah, so lots and lots of lists and lots of counting. Yes, we'll produce this book.
Also goes back to the modern traditions of making lists and counting things.
Indeed.
Very old
Oh,
and
indeed.
venerable.
There's sort of a meta level to this because the term tasmiyah, of course, occurs within the title of the History of Damascus. And tasmiyah, one of the senses of it is enumeration or making lists. And also there's hundreds of lists, tasmiyahs, within the History of Damascus. And we counted those too. So we counted how many, how many times he refers to a list with Badr, et cetera. The people who died at Badr, et cetera. Yeah.
So interesting. I would like to talk more about maybe kind of the philosophy or phenomenology of numbers and counting in both your own work and then the historical tradition, but we should probably save that for another conversation.
Excellent. Okay.
And there's just so much. Yeah, we'll save maybe more of the content of your research for another time. Because I have a lot of additional questions that I'd like to ask you, but I'll hold off. We're pretty much out of time. Try to keep this not terribly long, but we've covered a lot. And this has been really, really fascinating.
Oh, it's fun.
So
of course I'm delighted to be able to talk about the book.
Oh, and like I said, I would love to have you back later on and do another talk on some other topics. Because I'm pretty sure we have not exhausted like the store of of information and ideas that you've kind of accumulated. All right, so I think we'll stop it there. But you
Thank
will
you. Thanks, Jonathan.
hopefully rejoining us pretty soon to talk about something else that's related but different. We'll just leave it at that. So viewers out there, stay tuned, and we'll be back soon.